Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Megan Rust, Interpretation Director at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's Curators Perspective, Alma W. Thomas, Learning from the Artist-Educator. Closed captioning is available. You can turn live captioning on or off by using the controls at the bottom of your screen. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples, elders, and ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them and offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that support us. Tonight's program is presented in conjunction with the opening of Alma W. Thomas' Everything is Beautiful. This major retrospective follows the trailblazing artist's journey from Columbus, Georgia to Washington, D.C. to becoming the first Black woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City in 1972 when she was 80 years old. We are grateful to have the exhibition's co-curators, Seth, Feman, and Frederick Walz here with us to present this evening's lecture. But before I introduce Seth and Jonathan, I'd like to share a few reminders and acknowledge our sponsors. Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful is co-organized by the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, and the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Georgia. The Frist Art Museum gratefully acknowledges the exhibition supporters. AFLAC is proud to sponsor Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful. The exhibition has been made possible in part by major support from the Henry Luce Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. The exhibition is supported in part by Ameriprise Financial and Spanish translation sponsor, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Vanderbilt University. And as always, we're grateful for the continuing operating support from the Frist Foundation, the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. At the end of the program, we'll take questions from the audience. We invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature anytime throughout the presentation. And I'd like to thank you in advance for your patience with us as we present this program online. In the event of a technical difficulty, we'll pause the presentation and we'll work quickly to resolve the issue. If you're having technical difficulties on your personal device, please use the chat feature and send me a message and I'll do my best to assist you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Seth Feman and Frederick Walz. Seth Feman is the Deputy Director for Art and Interpretation and the Curator of Photography at the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia. His exhibitions and essays on American art and photography examine how qualities of affect, mobility, and vision become embedded in the museum spaces, the built environment, the language of the media, and specific works of art. His scholarship has received support from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Getty Foundation, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. At the Chrysler, he oversees the curatorial, education, and registration departments to develop dynamic exhibitions and engaging public programming. Feman has taught at the College of William and Mary and Lewis and Clark College, and has worked as an educator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. He received his BA in Art History from Vassar College and his MA and PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary. You may have seen our big announcement yesterday. The Frist Art Museum's Board of Trustees announced Seth Feman as the museum's new Executive Director and CEO, and we are thrilled to welcome Seth to the Frist full-time in April. An expert on American modernism, Frederick Walz received his MA and a PhD both in art history from the University of Maryland, College Park. His dissertation analyzed the transatlantic modernist avant-garde and their use of alternative portrayal strategies during the 1910s and 1920s. He spent the 2009 and 2010 academic year at the David C. Driscoll Center as one of six graduate student curators for the exhibition Embodied Black Identities in American Art from the Yale University Art Gallery, which appeared at the David Driscoll Center and the Yale University Art Gallery and was reviewed in the New York Times. He's published essays and given lectures on a range of topics, from Charles Demuth and Alma W. Thomas to conceptual portraiture and queer rurality. As a proponent of object-based study in public history, Walz has over 25 years of experience in art museums, including more than a decade of service at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In 2016, he was appointed the Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Curator of American Art at the Columbus Museum in Columbus, Georgia, Alma Thomas's hometown. Walz has begun researching for a future exhibition and catalog from George Catlin to David Hockney, Deaf Artists in the United States, 1788 through 1988. Please join me in welcoming Seth Feman and Jonathan Friedrich Walz.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that very generous and informative introduction and welcome. We're thrilled to be here and really grateful for the Frist's role in the traveling of the exhibition, and the installation is really just makes our hearts happy, and it's been a pleasure to work with the staff here. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, I agree. The Frist team has done an incredible job installing it. And tonight, what we're going to do is walk you through some installation images first of the first installation, the one at the Chrysler Museum. So you'll still need to come into the Frist Museum and see for yourself what the exhibition looks like, because it takes on new shape here. And the team has done an extraordinary job. I can't wait for everyone out there to come in and take a look. So the way that tonight will go is that Jonathan and I will go back and forth as we walk you through some slides of the installation at the Chrysler and talk about the overall themes of the exhibition. And then each of us will take a turn doing a deep dive of the things that we've researched on our own independently and contributed in some ways to the catalog. And so without further ado, and in the interest of time, I'm going to just jump right in so we can get started. So again, let's start in the most important place, which is a welcome. One of the things that we oftentimes do when we talk about Thomas is talk about what really matters in her art. And I think a lot of people know her as a painter. They know of her as having objects that go on the wall. But over the years, as Jonathan and I have been working on her, we found that her creativity was expressed in a more a complete way, a more comprehensive way, by interweaving various interests throughout her life. We would now use the term interdisciplinary. She was a gardener, she was into theater, she was into music, she was a community organizer, she was a teacher, and she thought of her artwork as embracing all of those activities. So much so that I think when we describe her as an artist, the core of what she does is create community. And even though we're virtual here, Jonathan and I both feel an immense sense of gratitude that we get to bring people together through an appreciation of her art. So we start by saying thank you and welcome, and we're glad to share this with you. So let's go into the space.
One of the tasks of the curator is to think about how artists and their art have been presented previously, how the material has been researched, and based on what we knew about the exhibition record of Alma Thomas, we felt very strongly about lengthening the narrative and also making it more complicated. And this vignette has been kind of an iconic way for us to kind of almost right off the bat inform the visitor that this exhibition will have a lot more in it than just Alma Thomas paintings. We really wanted to present her as round a person as possible. If you've heard anything about Alma Thomas without knowing too much about her, you may know that, as Megan informed us, that she was the first graduate of the Fine Arts program at Howard University in 1924. She was the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney in 1972. And she was, her work was the first by an African-American woman to be added to the permanent collection of the White House Historical Society, Association. And all of those firsts, I think we came to feel that they really almost obscure a much fuller picture of, those are such great achievements that, you know, that's kind of her elevator speech. But we wanted to make the story a lot more complicated than just those three facts. So this vignette presents objects that she lived with in her living space. We really were thinking a lot about what she surrounded herself with, and in this interdisciplinary way and material culture way, wanted to include things like this lamp, like this chair, which was a pair that was, she considered one of her favorites of the furniture that she owned. Things like a marionette from the 1930s, a sculpture of a bust of a young woman from the 1920s, and then also work by other artists that she surrounded herself with. So on the top left, we have an image by Jacob Kanan, who was a good friend of hers, and also a portrait of Thomas by the African-American woman artist Laura Wheeler Waring. I think another kind of thread that we wanted to pull through the show was, in fact, as these two paintings indicate, how well connected she was. And, you know, she wasn't just operating in isolation, or she just wasn't only teaching junior high students. I think over time, as we worked on the show, it became really, really apparent what, like, almost a kind of interpersonal crossroads she was. She was really one of those people who's a connector. And she moved easily across the color line and worked alongside African-American artists in Washington and white artists in Washington, and was really successful in bringing those groups together through art. And so that's yet another thread that we wanted to talk about in the exhibition.
So the exhibition opens in its proper form. It opens with a sort of mini version of Alma Thomas's Whitney exhibition. So if people know just one thing about Alma Thomas, it tends to be, as we've mentioned a couple times here already, she was the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney when she was 80 years old. And it is a major accomplishment, but we wanted to put that accomplishment in some context. It's an accomplishment because, as you can see when you look around the room here, you see some of her most accomplished works getting installed in this major American museum. And they show the variety of her work from the mid-60s on to 1971, 72, right when the show was unveiled. So it shows an important period of what we would call now her signature style. But the accomplishment was also due to a series of things that you can't quite see in this display here, but are documented through papers that are in the room as well, and are suggested by the way that the room is installed. The room is very crowded, it's a smaller space, and that's accurate to how it was at the Whitney itself. It was in the lobby gallery, which was downstairs and off to the side, not in the main exhibition galleries. And many of the artists who were showing here when the Whitney decided to begin showing African-American artists, and there were several African-American men who came before Alma Thomas came as the first African-American woman, they were displeased with the fact that they were separated out into a separated, some felt segregated space, and that it was a small space for a smaller exhibition rather than the large spaces. The decision of the Whitney to do this, to have these shows, was in part due to demonstrations by protesters in New York over several months, several years if you think about an ongoing set of pressures, but the Whitney had been going on for several months. And Thomas was not a part of those. She was not overtly political, and she didn't demonstrate with this group, but she was absolutely the beneficiary of their struggle and their effort when she had this show, and we wanted to put that into this context as well. The last thing that I'll mention about the Whitney installation is that one of the things we uncovered in our research was that the Whitney installation was largely based on a show that happened here in Nashville at Fisk that was put together by Thomas's friend David Driscoll, who at the time was the curator at the Fisk University Art Gallery. And he had given Thomas this incredible show, and Thomas had come to Nashville wearing the same dress that she ultimately wore to the Whitney exhibition. You can see a reproduction here in the slide. And when, after the show, he wrote to the director and the curator at the Whitney and said, "You ought to show this artist's work. She's really incredible, and you should take it seriously." And he basically gave them the opportunity to digest the show and represent a version of it, which they gladly did, but did not acknowledge him until now. And we're pleased that in the installation at the Frist, they've done an incredible job of adding documentation from Fisk University to share about that history. So you can explore that when you're here.
Really, one of the impetuses of the exhibition was the fact that Thomas's youngest sister, John Maurice, presented over a series of gifts some really interesting material related to the artist and to the Canty Thomas family, both in Columbus and in Washington. And you know, when we were considering past scholarship in relationship to what archival documents, ephemera, personal effects, and photographs that the Columbus Museum stewards as part of this gift from John Maurice, we realized that it really helped us kind of expand the story because it provided a lot of information about the lead up to 1960 when Thomas retires. And sort of the myth that we wanted to bust was that, you know, there's kind of this thought that received notion even that, you know, Thomas sort of springs full blown onto the art scene in the 60s. And basically through early paintings and a lot of the documentation that's at the Columbus Museum, as well as the Archives of American Art, we were really able to kind of basically explode that myth and present material that really documents how she progressed over time, such that her achievement really seems like a true achievement, not just sort of this fluke that this older woman who was a school teacher stumbles upon a style and then kind of wows the New York art world. You know, she really paid her dues, and we really wanted to explicitly be able to tell that part of the story in the exhibition. So what we're looking at is a range of paintings that are in chronological order from left to right. They start in the 1920s and end in the early 1960s, but you can really see clearly here how she starts out painting exactly kind of transcriptions of what she sees. And then in the next two images, you can see how she's looking at observable reality, but beginning to break it down into basic shapes. The horizontal image there in the middle is actually a still life if you look really carefully, but it's so abstracted by this point that the kind of objects in the still life are barely discernible any longer. And then she finally frees herself and gives herself permission to basically just investigate paint and its properties and think about kind of compositions in this very formalist way. Something that the Columbus Museum is very strong in is these small studies that she used to create her larger compositions. And you can really see here how she would fixate on a particular compositional choice, but really push it in all of these different kinds of directions and investigate options, which she would then show to friends like Jacob Kanan, like Dr. Driscoll, who visited her studio and would work through the various kind of studies to decide like what she was going to end up enlarging. So here we have a range of these kind of color blocks that are in vertical patterns, and you can see how she's reversed the color scheme in the very last image on the right.
This opens up into another section that is based on Thomas's garden, and one of the archival finds that really delighted us was to see images of Thomas's backyard garden, which she planted thick with all kinds of plants. And we sort of learned from looking at the photos and talking to other people that she activated her garden in a way so that there was always something growing and other things kind of dying away. Her attention was really drawn to the cyclical process of nature, that things grow and fade. And she seems to have found just as much beauty in the decay as she did in the bloom and the growth, or at least as much fascination in them. And she started to draw on that cyclical notion when she would start exploring her painting. So you see a group of images on the wall in the background, which are all garden inspired. She's looking at nature, but she's using it as an opportunity to also think through memory. And so the painting on the far left that you see, the blue painting, is one that is actually a memory painting. It's a painting in which she's thinking about her childhood in Columbus, Georgia, where she would walk along a riverbank and lay underneath a poplar tree and listen to the sound of the wind as it passes through. And she describes this very directly later in life, the memory of the sound, and she wanted to envision that in paint. And so you get this very dynamic image that sort of breaks from left to right, or dissembles from left to right as you move across the painting. The other thing that we wanted to show in this section was the stylistic variety of the artist. Oftentimes, if you go to a museum, you might see one Alma Thomas painting, or maybe two, and it may seem that she just has kind of one style. She's a one-hit wonder, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. Within the bounds of her stylistic interest, she explored many themes, and you can see along this wall, I know it's sort of small, you can't get into detail, but she's breaking up forms, she's using different colors, she's playing with the negative space and the foreground, she's doing underpainting, all exploring different modes and different expressions usually by getting inspiration from the natural world.
The next section deals with her kind of movement through various aspects of the public sphere. She wasn't only an artist educator or community organizer. She had other aspects of a kind of public persona that she presented to the world. And one aspect of that we've highlighted that I don't think's really been treated before is the importance to her of spirituality. Like she really believed in active service as kind of her devotional practice, but she also really had recourse to the history of art and religious imagery. On the left is a entombment scene from the Passion of Christ, and then also later, she really kind of moves into this abstract direction, but the titles of the one on the bottom right, for example, is called Transcendence. And so like she's really thinking about abstraction as a way to maybe engage with these very numinous kinds of ideas and thoughts. We'll just briefly mention that her engagement in the classroom also bled over into her engagement with theater. She was very interested in theater throughout her childhood onward, even as she was teaching and later in life attending performances. So I'll talk a little bit more about the marionettes and their importance to her practice later in the talk. And just briefly, some more objects that relate to her relationship to the stage. On the left are costume designs that caught the eye of James Herring at Howard University, which he convinced her then to transfer to the fine arts department. And then the middle image has kind of an interesting backstory in that it's called Macy's Day. And the Macy's Day large balloon figures were actually innovated by someone that she studied with named Tony Sarg. She took a marionettes course in the summer of 1935 with Tony Sarg. And as I've worked with Thomas and her interest in marionettes, I've come to believe that this is a kind of homage to a former teacher.
So when you leave the public sphere and theater sections of the exhibition, you enter the field, and this was the largest section of the show. And we spent a lot of time thinking about it because, as Jonathan mentioned earlier on in the talk tonight, we really wanted to show Thomas's role in the art world, the larger art world, and disabuse people of the myth that she emerged in the 1960s as an artist full-blown out of nowhere. And what we've done here in this section, we're looking at a painting by another artist named John Robinson, who painted the inside of the Barnett Aiden Gallery, which was a Black-owned, queer-owned gallery in Washington, D.C. that was one of only a few places to see modern and contemporary art at the time. It opened in 1942, and Thomas was the vice president into the 60s and would sit at the circular desk that you see painted here and welcome people into the gallery, show them work. Sometimes her work would be on view. And it's also where she got to know artists who would later become famous as being part of the Washington Color School. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. But what you see here is her integral role from early on in a dynamic art scene that is often overlooked in her narrative.
One of the things that we do in the exhibition is to really highlight her time with her family in Columbus, Georgia, which is about 90 miles southwest of Atlanta on the Alabama border. And actually her grandfather had a large farm in Alabama, so the family crossed the river to visit very frequently when they lived in town. They moved away in 1907, but she really never lost this sense of Southernness, which really became apparent to us as we were working on the show and working at institutions that are in the South. And we wanted to highlight that a little bit, but also to piggyback on what Seth was saying, the relationships that she developed over time. And so this is one. On the left, we're looking at a pine tree painting by David Driscoll, possibly from his thesis exhibition at Catholic University of America in 1959, and pairing it with a work by Thomas from her just after she finishes her studies at American University, also from 1959, and also included in an important two-person show that she was part of at American University in 1959. So one of the just sort of discoveries for us of the exhibition was locating a few recordings of her voice, and we just wanted to share her accent with all of you so that we can, I think you'll see that she really never kind of lost her Southern charm.
I was ill during 64 and 65, but Mr. Porter said if I wanted to have a show at Howard University, before they had their centennial, I would have to have it in 66 and not 68.
So the last part of this installation shows Alma Thomas's work, which you see down the left wall, confronted by works by other artists who were associated with the Washington Color School. Thomas gets kind of compiled with them in contemporary museums now. She's sort of presented as if she's one of them. But her work really stands apart, and it's something you can't appreciate in reproduction. But when you see these works looking at one another, although there's familiar forms, there's circles and lines and angles, the handling of paint is completely different. She's oftentimes treated as somebody who looked at these other artists and sometimes derived her style from them, but it's absolutely not true. She was really forging an independent path, and you see how innovative she was when you match these works up against one another. And it's something really special about the show, because no Alma Thomas exhibition to date has really put these things together in real time and space. Oftentimes, the Washington Color School artists get illustrated in the catalog, but here we invite you to make the comparison yourself.
Lastly, the show ends spectacularly with this work that became the touchstone as we worked on the exhibition. It's called Red Azaleas, Singing and Dancing Rock and Roll Music. And it just really, for us, came to embody all of the themes of the exhibition: music, performance, her love of the natural world, movement, and self-actualization, in the sense that she paints this in her 80s, and it's the largest work she ever created. It's 13 feet wide when she was herself only 5 feet 1 inch tall. So just the incredible amount of energy and drive and ambition that she tapped into to create this work. For us, it just kind of became the signature icon of the show.
So there's a lot more that the show itself has to offer, and we hope that you will come in and take a look. But what we wanted to do with the remaining time tonight was to share a couple of things that you can't really see on the wall, but I think are beneficial to know about. You can learn about them more if you dig into the catalog, which we would love for you all to do. But we'll give you a little teaser of some of our own research. And this begins one of the things that seemed so important to me when I started researching Thomas. You have an image of her in the classroom on the left and an image of her on the right from the 1970s, 1976. And the story about Thomas is this story in which she is a teacher for nearly 40 years in the classroom, and then she becomes an artist. And people would say things at the time, and even now, they say things like, it was only when she retired from teaching, only then did she become an artist. Only after decades of laboring away did she realize her artistic career. And it's a nice way of thinking about her, but it's a sort of inspiring story that you can have a second career or a third career, you can go on to do other things. But it diminishes the fact that she was, as we've described earlier tonight, active in the opposite way as well. She was active as an artist. You see on the left an image from the 1920s of her at Howard, and you see an image on the right, possibly my favorite image of Alma Thomas of all time, in which she's with a group of students in the 1970s. After she retires from teaching, she's engaged in her social activity, which is mostly teaching through community organizations, really for the rest of her life. And a lot of things happen when you have this division. It creates a kind of false narrative about creativity. It also creates this division between what is art and what is not art. And that really bothered me. I really wanted to unpack that because I didn't think that Alma Thomas really bought into that. And I think that she thought that that was a bogus distinction as well. Yeah. So I started digging deep into Thomas's artistic training as a teacher. And what I found was that she began her training here at the Armstrong Manual Training School, which was effectively a vocational school. But at the school, she was trained by a man named Hunster. And Hunster had innovated a new curriculum for the African American schools that allowed the students and encouraged the students to do freehand drawing, unlike what they were sort of being instructed to do before, which was mechanical drawing, or drawing that was sort of technologically driven. In his freehand classes as well, they were inspired and asked to make drawings from life, and rather than copying from sketchbooks, which was the more formal and traditional way in the 19th and early 20th century of learning how to draw. She found this to be an evocative place. She said that it was in this classroom that she laid the foundation for her life, and it meant both as an artist and as a teacher, which is what she was training to do. These are images that were made by another student in Hunster's class, and it's the front and back of the same page. On the left, you see an image of a parrot that he kept in the room so students could draw from it in life. And on the back, you see this incredibly elegant, really wonderful magnolia. Possibly these are two different hands. It's not quite clear. But what you see is that the students were actively thinking about nature. And what Hunster was doing was something that we now call correlating the curriculum. And what that means is that you're having one discipline inspire another discipline. So one exercise that his students would do, for example, was that they would draw a garden and then they would draw the plants as if they were growing over time so they could understand the mechanics of how a plant grows by drawing it. And then older students would actually go out into the community and plant their gardens and watch them mature over time. So it became an integral thing in Thomas's own learning. Thomas went on to the Monroe School, the minor school, and she worked at the Monroe School. Monroe School was the teaching or the demonstration school for minor normal, which is a teaching college, basically. And one of the things that she would have encountered was something like this, which was a museum display. I know it's small and probably hard to see, but it's called The Story of Illumination. And students would do just as I described in Hunster's class. They would draw lighting from throughout the ages, so they would learn the history of lighting and technology from candles to lamps to electronics. And they would draw them to understand the actual mechanics of how it would work, and then they would bring in real examples so they could understand how they're going, how they operate, and then they would show this in a museum presentation, so they would learn about how to explain it to other people. So you get a full picture of the history, the drawing, the mechanics, and the conversation around it. So when Thomas started her own classroom, she put these things into action. On the left, you see one of her classrooms, and my favorite detail is that you can see over the windows and doors, they put butcher block paper and made these drawings on them. There are many anecdotes about her covering the windows with butcher block paper and the students coloring on them to create kind of stained glass. And some versions of the story say that it was used to block out the world outside. Some versions of the story say that it was meant to beautify the world outside so that it was coming through in a new way. But Thomas' interest in the classroom was to get students engaged in the world at large. And what you see on the right is a group of students that she brought to the Howard University Art Gallery in an after-school program, an extracurricular program, where they would learn about the old masters. You can see them exploring one of the reproductions here. And they would also learn about the city and the places where the students could go to learn more about art. So she would literally send them across the city to learn about the place where they lived. It also included her recognition of what was then called Negro History Week. Now we know it as Black History Month. And she would work with her students to make things like this, a print that would commemorate the event, but also would get the students engaged in a social activity. So art had a purpose. It wasn't for beauty's sake alone. This culminated in an event with a student. I just love this moment. She and a student named Belvin Debney go to the Corcoran where objects had been deaccessioned, these plaster busts, and she acquired them for the Shaw School so that her students could learn from them. But the interesting part of the story is that at the time, the Corcoran was not seen as a place that was hospitable to African Americans. In fact, Lois Mailou Jones, an African American artist, famously had her friend go deliver her art and pick up her award when she won, because she didn't feel that she was welcome there. And here you see Alma Thomas waltzing in with a student who picks up the works of art. And the student, we know from research, goes on to have an engaged civic career for years to come. So art is a vehicle for becoming deeply invested in community. The last picture I'll show is this image from later. It's in the 1960s when Thomas is probably retired at this point. And she's working with a group of students at St. Luke's, which was her church right around the corner from her house. And you can see these characters that they've made, these sculptures, very colorful, and students are very proud of them, presenting with them. My favorite detail here is not just who it depicts and what it depicts them, but it's this mark of paint on the side of the photograph. We know that it means that this was kept in her home. She painted her home this blue color. They used it in the installation of the exhibition. It also shows up in her works of art. And it really emphasizes for me this blending of her educational world, the world of children, and her high art aspirations. It really emphasizes that all these things go hand in hand. So that's where I'll stop.
I think my research on the marionettes started with a question about why they weren't included in previous exhibitions on Thomas. Actually, the show in 1981-82 did include this puppet, but subsequent exhibitions really have focused on her painting, and certainly they are beautiful and informative and wonderful to look at in person. But I was very curious because especially the Columbus Museum owns 5 puppets, and I wanted to know more about them and kind of the role that they played in her sort of career trajectory. I think something also that Seth brought to the table that really inspired me to keep thinking in this direction is how we wanted to think about the late work as the result of all of these other activities and incidents and events that had taken place beforehand. And so I was really searching for sort of a relationship between the marionettes and the later painting. Something that also just made me really curious was that despite the handful of shows on Thomas since her passing in 1978, no one had really, well, scholars have indicated that, she was involved with puppetry in the 1930s, but even though it's well known that she wrote her master's thesis on this material, for which she received her degree in arts education in 1934 from Columbia University, no one had actually really consulted the document. And I just felt that there might be some really interesting clues or at least key pieces of information in this document that would help us understand better the role they played in her life. And so I made a beeline to Columbia to find this document and share it with Seth. Another reason why I was interested in this material is because the museum where I work has this cache of unpublished, kind of rediscovered material that is really being brought to bear for the first time on this exhibition itself. And here you see one of the reasons why we know so much about the puppets is that Thomas herself was an ambitious teacher. She really wanted to keep kind of progressing in her career and be remunerated for that. And so what she had to do was to create these kind of portfolios that demonstrated not just her work in the classroom, not just her innovative curriculum, but also her engagement with the local community. And so this is a perfect example of where all of those interests come together. We have this folder of information with a letter from James Herring talking about how she came with her students to perform at Howard University. We have these announcement cards at bottom right talking about the admission price and what the production would be, and then the participants' names of students. Just very rich information that I think really changed how I thought about Thomas and her later work. One thing we also used the exhibition to do was to perform some conservation on the puppets that we knew about. And so this puppet of the Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, which was a show that she and her students put on in the early 1930s, had over time sustained some damage. And so we were able to use the exhibition as a way to get these works exhibition ready and then be able to share them with the public. But you can see here kind of part of the construction. What fascinated me about these Alice in Wonderland puppets specifically is that the feet of the puppets are actually melted lead weights, so that there's a real heft to them as you're performing with them. Unfortunately, the puppet on the left was not able to be included in the exhibition, even though the Columbus Museum owns it, specifically because it was too fragile to travel. But happily, as part of the organization of the exhibition, once word got out that we were working on an Alma Thomas show, things started to come out of the woodwork, and I was just beyond thrilled when I got an email out of the blue from someone in the Washington, D.C. area who happened to have a character from the Alice in Wonderland production. This is Humpty Dumpty, and I apologize for the poor slide, but that's a doctored version of what I was originally sent, but it just made my heart sing to see an additional puppet that I had no idea about. I also was curious about why there was this kind of distinction between Thomas's kind of fine art as a painter and her work with the theater, her work with marionettes, because as a modernist scholar myself, I knew that other modernists had puppets made, and that was considered part of their production. Like, it was very matter-of-factly considered worthy of artistic attention. And I wondered why in the world wasn't Alma Thomas's puppets given the same kind of consideration. So on the left, we're looking at modernist puppet by Alexandra Exeter, and on the right, one of my favorite artists, Gustav Baumann, who was also well known for his marionette shows in the early part of the 20th century. Lastly, as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of be able to draw some kind of connection, at least for myself, between the early work of the puppets and the marionette theater and later work. And so I think for me, this real kind of frontality and verticality that accompanies the marionette productions, I think really becomes a foundational element of how she conceives of her late paintings, when basically the first four that she creates in this broken brushmark style are horizontal, and then she completely abandons that and never creates another image in that format again, but really relies heavily on this vertical format. So at least in my own mind, I see this kind of thread that gets pulled through from the marionettes to the later paintings. And just another example where I don't think, is this in the show? In the presentation here?
I'm not sure if it's still in.
Right, so, but this is just an example of one of her late works that I think, again, if you want to get fancy.
There's similar works in the show.
Right, there are similar works in the show. If you want to get fancy in your thinking that there seems to be some kind of relationship between these late watercolors that are incredibly amazing, that she's continuing to innovate even into 1977, just the year before she passes away, and perhaps the view from above that a marionette performer would see as they're performing the production as a performer. We just wanted to give a shout out as we wrap up that there is a film that was developed in conjunction with the exhibition. It's on view in the exhibition. We hope that you'll check it out. It's a great kind of 15-minute overview of Thomas and a lot of the main themes that we address in the exhibition. And it's also available online via Vimeo, so you can also own it if you want to, or just view it on your computer. And also just to mention that we spent a lot of time and research and getting another kind of community together in the scholars that we invited to provide information and essays for the exhibition catalog. So we hope that you'll check that out as well.
So I think we'll stop the share. If there are questions, we would love to take them. And maybe Megan, if you're out there, you could help us field some of those.
Yes, thank you both so much for this great introduction to the exhibition. We do have some questions in our Q&A, and it looks like maybe in the chat too. Let's see here. Elizabeth asks about the painting by Alma Thomas from Jubilee Hall at Fisk that's included in the exhibition. I think she's referring to spring flowers around Jefferson Memorial. Did you want to share anything about the Fisk loans that we have?
Oh, well,
Yes.
First of all, thank you for their generosity.
Yes.
Like, it was such an important venue for her. Like, she had no clue in 1971 when she's coming to Nashville. Like, this is the largest, kind of show and most exciting show that she's had to date in her life. And it was quite large, actually. And so she had no clue that the Whitney was going to happen. And so I think just the energy and drive that it confirmed in her, I think, is just so important. And so it just makes us so happy to know that there is work there. And in fact, in some recent research I've done, it turns out that quite a lot of the work that was in the Fisk show was sold locally. Like it was really like local people showing up, enjoying the work and wanting to live with it. And so I'm sure it's found its way into other family members or galleries at this point, but it really struck me like how much work she sold out of that exhibition.
And just to say, yes, that the work is in the exhibition, and in this installation, it has pride of place. It's the first thing that you see when you enter the show, and it looks glorious there. So all the more reason to come check it out.
It's a beautiful painting. Tony asks about the solo show at the Whitney. He says, why do you think it's taken so long to revive interest in Alma Thomas's work?
So there's been, so it's a really good question, because there has been interest in her work over time, and
especially in Washington, D.C.
Especially in Washington, D.C., and some in New York. But all of the posthumous retrospectives to date have really focused on Thomas's what we would call her signature style or mature work. So works that are made after the mid-60s, and really they focused on works from the 70s. And that's one of the things that we started with. We both value those exhibitions so much, but we found that there was this larger story. There's basically half of her life, almost 3/4 of her life, that is undocumented in an exhibition. It comes up in catalogs. So we thought it was a good time to share the kind of dynamism and what we would now call the interdisciplinary quality of her work in a new way.
In my mind, I think what really happens in terms of interest in her work is that, unfortunately for Thomas and the other Washington Color School artists, that they were really supported critically by Clement Greenberg. And so at a certain point, that critical viewpoint is really just kind of shredded, and the art associated with it really becomes kind of like basement art, like that it's not cool and it has all kinds of issues with it. And so I think she really, her work gets lumped into that kind of formalist painting that Clement Greenberg was kind of advocating for. And so it really took until 1998 for an art historian and curator to really kind of get the resources together to put a show on. And that was the second show after Thomas passed away. So I don't know if we can fully explain why she was sort of neglected for so long, but we certainly know why revival in interest has happened because of the Obamas.
Yes,
in 2009, they are redecorating the private quarters of the White House, and so they, one of the loans that they borrow is a Alma Thomas painting from the Hirshhorn, and it sets off this kind of explosion of curiosity by the general public, and also sort of art historians who maybe had forgotten about Thomas, wondering who this African-American woman artist is all of a sudden. So anyway.
But I think it's worth putting an emphasis around that the interest in her became a little bit self-fulfilling, because the interest in her automatically zooms in on the fact that she created most of her recognizable painting late in life, that it was after retirement. And the interest becomes about these transition moments, and the result is that it does a disservice to the breadth of her career, which is something we really hope that we've been able to shift the conversation.
Another great question in the chat about how you chose your themes for the exhibition. And to add on to that, I would love to learn a little bit more about your decision to choose a thematic installation instead of a chronological one.
Yeah.
I blame Seth. But in all seriousness, Seth really brought the conceptual framework to the project. I'm so grateful for that. It just seems so very smart to me. But I think on on top of that, based on previous projects and what we knew about Thomas's life and career, we really wanted to avoid a kind of very straightforward chronological way of considering her work. It's very traditional. It's very, I think, relatable and understandable because you can kind of see growth over time. But given that so much of previous scholarship has kind of dug that discourse into almost like a rut, we wanted to kind of reimagine how we approach the material.
So one of the things that we did early on was we laid down little copies of all of the work, and we did look at things chronologically. And one of the things that it does is it reinforces this myth of transition over time, because the marionettes all exist in a certain period early on. They were created then. We know from photographs in the 70s that she never puts them away. She keeps them around. But if you line everything up chronologically, it sort of suggests that she's interested in marionettes, and then she's done. She teaches, and then she's done. She paints, and then she's gone. But what we knew is that she didn't ascribe to those categories, those sort of rigid categories. So we tried as best as possible to listen to the archive, to listen to her, to listen to people who knew her, and create these thematic groupings based around her areas of creative interest, and then use the show as a way of demonstrating how they wove together. And that's why the image that Jonathan started with, the slide that Jonathan started with that shows what I'm calling diorama, the mixture of all of these things, including the chair and a dress reproduction, that's so important because that really demonstrates how each zone of the exhibition comes together in a conversation. It was a choice. It was a complicated decision that I'm glad ultimately in the end that we did it that way.
I think too, it really speaks to the fluidity of these areas of her life and how easily she just moved among them, and really made very little distinction between cultivating a garden and cultivating students, for example. So there's just so much relationality that putting them into sort of very rigid chronological chunks just didn't make sense to us.
Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more. You have done, I love the way that the exhibition puts Alma Thomas's work into context with other artists. We have a question in the Q&A about Helen Frankenthaler and whether or not Thomas knew her or knew of her work. And this, Patricia points out that she had a large show at the Whitney 2 years before Thomas did.
So there's so many things to say about that. I mean, I think one thing is that when Kenneth Noland and Maurice Lewis go to New York, of course, they visit Helen Frankenthaler and then bring that idea of these staining and soaked large areas of colored, like sort of, what do I want to say, like thin paint,
and allowing it to saturate into the canvas.
So like obviously she would have known about that, but that's fairly late. I mean, so the other answer, I think, is that she's just very art smart. There's so many personal interviews and sources that talk about like her library was extensive. That was kind of a legacy of her having studied with James Herring. She's reading all the time. She says she keeps up with what's going in the art world. She goes to galleries all the time. We know that she's going to New York, and she's really up on what's happening because it's important to her. And so, like, there's not like a very direct influence in terms of Helen Frankenthaler and Thomas, but she certainly would have known the work and would have appreciated it, I think.
It's a really important point because she, again, it sort of disabuses of this myth that she just sort of like finds her way into an innovative style. The way that she finds her way into her style, as the studio section of the exhibition shows, is that she practices. She tries to figure out how to make forms that express what she wants to. And the other thing that she does is she reads and visits galleries and talks to artists. So even though there's not a clear correlation to Frankenthaler, we don't know if they ever met, she would have absolutely known of her work, and she knew of so many artists' work, and her house was effectively a library, and she traveled through Europe studying art. She was interested in what was going on and learning from other artists. So absolutely would have connected.
I think a really great sort of example of that is how in 1958 she takes a 7-week trip to Europe, and specifically like she's visiting cultural sites like cathedrals and art museums and other places, but it also happens to be the year that the Venice Biennale is on view, and it just also happens that Mark Tobey is the American representative, and he actually wins the Golden Lion that year. So, you know, she was very aware. And so even if we can't make a direct connection, I'm quite sure she would have known the work and appreciated the work.
Well, thank you both again for a great introduction to this exhibition, and we hope you all will come see it in person at the Frist Art Museum. Alma W. Thomas, Everything is Beautiful is on view in our upper level galleries until June 5th. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.